Hello, I'm Paddy Delaney, and welcome to Integrated Infrastructure, a podcast dedicated to bringing you news and views from industry leaders involved in the development, design, construction and management of the many built forms that make up Australia's integrated infrastructure. This is the Integrated Infrastructure Podcast and our first podcast of 2021. And to kick off the year, we've got the brilliant Tim Williams. Tim is a historian, a political advisor, an academic, a barrister, and happens to be chair of Open Cities and a strategic advisor to Arup Australasia. Amongst other things, he was chief executive for the Committee of Sydney and advised the Blair and Brown governments in the UK. Tim is madly passionate about cities and how people work, live, create wealth and culture in them. In this podcast, Tim tells us why he feels we're at an existential crisis moment for the future of our cities. Tim lays out the role of cities as creators of wealth, ideas and jobs, and talks about the perils of lockdowns and the working from home agenda for the future of the Australian economy. We talk about the need to reclaim our cities and our freedoms, or risk the cultural and societal benefits of city life. We talk about the housing market and the incredible factors that are leading to another year of projected growth in the face of a global pandemic, generated by what Tim calls the housing Ponzi scheme, or just housing porn. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Tim is an absolute pleasure to listen to. If you haven't already, please like, share, comment and subscribe. In the meantime, here's my conversation with Tim. Tim, welcome to Integrated Infrastructure. It's fantastic to have you on, and I'm very pleased to have you here. It would be great if we could start off by you introducing yourself, telling us a bit about yourself, who you are, a bit about your background, and we'll go from there.
I regard myself as Australia's leading Welsh Australian intellectual. So that's the first thing. There'll probably somebody pop out of the woodwork and say, no, you're not. But I'm in reverse order. Currently, I'm strategic advisor to Arup, kind of global engineering and integrated consultancy, indeed. In Australasia, I'm the kind of strategic advisor. Latterly, until November, I was the head of cities for Arup in Australasia, and I decided I'm going to try and write a few books. One of them is about the future of cities. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. But before then, for 6 years, 2011, 2017, I ran the Committee for Sydney, which became, I think, probably Australia's leading urban think tank policy thing. Partly because I was great running it, but also partly because our chair became Lucy Turnbull, who had just happened to be married to the Prime Minister. So that means a lot of ideas that we now hear about, like city deals and the Great Sydney Commission, came out of the work of the Committee for Sydney. So I'm very proud of that. And then before then, I'd been a government advisor in the UK on housing in cities, working for the Blair and Brown government, helping to bring things like big transport projects to East London and playing a role tangentially, more I think myself, but nobody noticed in helping to bring the Olympics to Stratford in East London. So a big kind of urban regeneration, public policy, working in government, private sector around cities, planning, and writing about it actually a lot, and I still write about it. So I'm that person. How I became that person, I can possibly explain to you, because I'd started. I'm a historian, and I got a PhD in Welsh history, and I qualified as a barrister, and I'm qualified to teach English to kids. It's all a bit weird. I didn't really have a proper career in my view between the age of 21 and 48 when I started running the East London kind of stuff. But essentially, I came to Australia in 2010. My wife is Australian, so we're always going to come back here. And I'm originally from South Wales. I deeply rooted in the sort of South Wales valleys, grew up in a mining town, public housing in a mining town, and I've been obsessed ever since with how working people do within our economic structures and our cities. So that's me.
Oh, fantastic!
Have I missed something?
It's not true that you weren't noticed in London, was it? You were noticed.
Well, it's I was a bit more behind the scenes, but in fact, I was shockingly, because my chair was a bit upset when I was noticed of the Thames Gateway Partnership. Partly because a thing I did for 1 week in London, I helped secure the Ford manufacturing company to stay making engines in Dagenham, and it was quite a big deal. But it was like 1 week, It was the Sunday Times in August 1999 said I was the 17th most important person in London. This is quite precise, right? 17. My friends all laughed at me, but I put it to them, would you like to be called the 17th most important person in London, whether it was right or not, And anyway, the problem only started when you realize the 18th was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and as a Welsh Protestant, I beat the second most important person in Christendom. You can't knock that. The problem, which I haven't told you about, is the 19th. The 19th was Arsene Wenger, the manager of Arsenal. And that was fine. But my family, my father's a big Arsenal fan. And he wrote a letter, which I have in Manly on the wall proudly, attacking the Sunday Times because he thought it was outrageous that I'd beaten Arsene Wenger. So he sent to him saying, look, you said last week my son Tim Williams was the 17th most important person in London. I have to tell you that Tim is not even the 17th most important person in my family. That's who I am. That's who I am. And I publish a lot about, and I advise governments and I advise kind of senior executives on like big city thinking and infrastructure projects.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, and cities is really our podcast is about bringing news, views, ideas, and concepts of around infrastructure, building, construction, energy, to people so that they can hear about sort of key people in the industry. And I think I'd known about you through our Arup connections before, but also was really intrigued by your article, which was probably more of a thought-provoking or comment sort of provoking.
Really? Do you think I do that, Paddy? Do you think I do that? Do you think I do it just to get a rise out of people? I don't think so. Anyway, Con.
Well, no. I don't think to get a rise, but you're actually inviting people to come and have a chat to you, aren't you? In that article, and tell us a bit about that and where that came from.
Well, I mean, look, cities, I think, one of the great inventions of humanity, and it's partly because I come from a small town, and when I found my own experience of London was like exploded in my consciousness. There's a great phrase from the medieval period in Germany, the Hanseatic ports, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes free. The way in which people have discovered themselves and wealth has been created and art and culture has been created in largely urban environments. I've just always been very interested in that. I'm a historian, and I thought, so given the opportunity to, pontificate about it, I'm not slow to do so. But I think what I was referring to, and I still think is the biggest issue, is that we are facing an existential crisis for our notion of the city because of the COVID crisis. And the response of public authorities and even the leaders of industry, in my view, has been really tepid. I think we've all been so shocked. I understand this by the sheer immediacy of coping with a health crisis that we're not thinking straight, I think, yet about what the economic future looks like. And I don't just mean, economic policy, pouring money into the economy from governments, how do we do all that? I mean, literally, the main engine of Australian growth, there have been two main engines of Australian growth. We always think of one. One is the mining sector, correctly, and the other one is the cities. The financial services of Sydney alone produces about 7 or 8% of the GDP of Australia, which is equivalent to the mining economy of Western Australia. Did you know that? Right?
No, I didn't.
So people, so protecting that, right? Understanding. It's all very well to talk about home working. We can talk about all this kind of stuff. Home working, isn't that great? Isn't that like, long overdue? Wow, decentralized working, fantastic. Think of the suburbs. Okay. But, here's a number for you that sums up the challenge of the moment. 64% of the population of New South Wales live in one city, Sydney, and it creates 70% of the wealth of the state, i.e. there's a premium from the functioning of Sydney's, essentially it's agglomerated professional financial services, all being damaged, destroyed in front of us, and through a combination of fear of public transport, worries about office environments, and the huge consequence there's been on the hospitality sector and all this kind of stuff. Wiping out 30 years of positive news about cities, because people forget, I'm old enough to understand this. If you went to a Melbourne in 1990, the city centre was empty, right? It was not what it is today. There were none of the laneways and there was nobody living there. right? Like all cities, they recovered in the 1990s and noughties. They call it the Great Inversion, as we remembered that knowledge workers, particularly knowledge jobs, have been agglomerating close to city centres. There are all sorts of problems with this, but you can't get away from the wealth effect that we have seen generated, so that Sydney becomes one of the top 10 financial services cities on the planet, and it becomes one of the more attractive places to relocate and all this kind of stuff. It has an ebullience and a dynamism that, boy, it didn't have in the early 90s. All that is now in play. All that, in my view, is now at threat. And I wrote the article because I wasn't seeing enough kickback from people. Yeah. There was a kind of, just last thing about this, there was just a kind of assumption, that things were like automatic, or in all senses, like automatically, the policy choices we make are kind of automatic. And then the recovery will be automatic, maybe. But also there's a kind of presumption that we can have the same wealth, the same society, but not have the CBD of our cities. I have never seen that shown by an economist. There's no economic thinking behind that. There's technology, there's people spruiking kind of, what decentralized working can do, but there's no economic thinking showing to me that decentralized economy is as productive, right, in terms of its spillover jobs because of agglomeration. So all this, it's probably the most long-winded answer to a single question that you have ever.
No, Tim, I love it, and I agree with it, and because one of the reasons we started this podcast is I was talking to people like Joanne Manning and Dave Harding back at the beginning of the crisis. Obviously, your colleagues from Arup, and we were talking about certain people are loving working from home. In fact, I was on that point in time when there was a webinar every hour that you could jump onto and hear about people's opinions about what was happening. And most of those people were saying how fantastic it was to work from home. But then I realised that they all had wonderful views and bookcases and desks and talking to Joanne.
I tell you what, Paddy. Tell you what, it's revived in me. A kind of peculiar combination of business common sense. Like how do we get the money from this new process to the kind of almost like a class consciousness that actually. There's been people doing it hard. And in fact, some people not doing it at all because they can't do their jobs from remote. There is no possibility of that. So I think it's, I'm really kind of passionate about this last bit. Somebody once described home working as middle-class people hiding from their fears and working-class people serving them, So I think there's a kind of, I also think, by the way, there's a regendering of the city coming without us even noticing about it. The fact that home working normally means, frankly, women trapped at home multitasking, and we will see a return to work, but I'm worried that there won't be as many women going back to the workplace and the CBD at the centre. And that, I'm serious about this, that a lot of the top jobs will therefore regress again to the men. We've got to watch out for the unintended consequences of this home working culture. I'll give you another one. I think people are being incredibly unreal about what markets do and what companies have to do. For example, right, home working is also consistent with AI, right? So there's been a shift to, and we're seeing it now, where jobs are disappearing. Not just the hospitality jobs, spillover jobs, but core jobs within companies will not be returning because people will be turning to technology. Because if you don't need to be in the office and that doesn't benefit the company, then the company starts thinking to itself, well, maybe I don't need you, right?
Yeah. So you can offshore it.
We can offshore it. I was going to say, so it doesn't just go to Balgala, it goes to Bangalore.
Yeah.
Right. And I think people are just being very unreal. There's a real need to get back to the office, by the way, to save other people's jobs. It's interesting, I think people are very capable of giving money to charity in the third world and without thinking about the hundreds of thousands of casual workers whose future is at risk at this point in time, because we have denuded the CBDs of their work. Right. So there's that going on. So I don't know that we've got a proper discussion going on. It's interesting. The New South Wales government, I think, is closest to all of them across this Australia in actually being a bit more galvanised about this. And before the recent setback, in the Northern Beaches and all that kind of stuff, they were at the point of running a campaign whose headline was effectively "The city is safe," right? And just to put that in context, we haven't even talked about this, but 1,000 people dying in Australia versus 100,000 in the UK, pro rata, it's about 5 times healthier in terms of outcomes. Why is that not a sales pitch?
Yeah, for
amongst the healthiest cities on the planet, being in Australia, rather than us being cowering in our home working environment? We should be bold now. This has been a tremendous triumph in comparison with you and I know the UK very well, and even though the numbers are they're not all comparable and stuff, but it's been a pretty poor performance in the UK by comparison with Australia.
Yeah, so I mean, we can measure the economic sort of effects of this, and we can see whether companies are performing or not, and in certain ways. But it's the dearth of opportunities to share ideas in person and to brainstorm and to innovate and what have you.
The very purpose of the city and its agglomeration to assemble clever people together. So through serendipity and happenstance, they create value. That is the very purpose. You cannot replicate that in a decentralized home working environment. In fact, all companies, it's interesting there's 2 dimensions that we need to think about. One is internationally, it's not all cultures are home working to the extent of the Anglosphere. This is quite interesting, right? Is that right? And secondly, the companies of different kinds are experiencing the lack of innovation experience if you have a job that really is quite commodified, then you can do it in a home working environment. If you have a kind of creative sort of role where you just bouncing off people, listening to other people in the office, so and you go over and say, I think we could do that's completely missing, and is the core of the knowledge economy premium, right? So I think that's crucial. The second thing that's interesting is culture, is that not all cultures have responded the same way to this threat, even if they've got similar health outcomes. So, for example, the Germans didn't do as much home working as the English did, and nor did the French. They also went back earlier, and of course, we know the Swedes, particularly, have not even locked down. So there were and the outcomes in Sweden are about the average for Europe. So there are really interesting. And look, I'm not glib, by the way. The one thing I'm not glib about is I'm glib about everything else. But I'm not glib about the fact of politicians, because I've worked in. See, there's a great paradox here. The great paradox of my life is that I know too much about how politicians actually behave. Because I've been a political advisor in the room when ministers were with competing information coming at them, having to make decisions, not quite as much as life or death as these decisions. So I'm very respectful. Right, of the difficulties of decision making by politicians when it's life and death. But I also am aware of the chaos that can be, and of the competing sources of information that can be weighing on the mind of a politician. And sometimes the media is a bigger impact than So I think Australia should have a different city's future to many other places on the planet, a much more confident one. Now look, the bit that we should talk about, which I think is definitely going to happen because of this experience, let us say that there will be, what we've seen already is a shift in rents. So that we've seen rents, publicly go down about 10, 12% in Sydney office rents. I think it's more like 15 to 20, right? So I think it's because, why would people tell us, right? Because but I think deals been done at a much lower rate. The residential property in area has been booming outside the cities, and units close to the city have been collapsing. So there's obviously people making they have a perception of density as being a problem, right? Which I think we need to really get on top of, because I think overcrowding has been a problem with health, but not density. So I think it's an interesting difference, right? But let us say there's going to be a long-term effect on lowering of rents in the CBD. I think that's true. There will be perhaps 80%, 75% return to office density. Not what people were fearing 6 months ago, which is like complete collapse. I think there will be, but there'll be younger people and there'll be, I think, a lot more young men, without underlying comorbidities or family concerns. We might see quite a cultural shift in the occupation of offices in the city. The upside, we will see more diverse companies coming into CBDs. The problem in Sydney has been it's so expensive and it's so small that we only get financial and professional services which are squeezed out things like restaurants.
Yeah.
So I think you might find a kind of Melbourne effect. Rents in Melbourne are half what they're in Sydney. Again, I don't know if people know that. So imagine if rents drop in Sydney, what might go into the CBD. So it's not like you're not going to see tumbleweed going around the CBD of Sydney. You're going to see it change. Unknowns, tourism, university students. If you look at this is I think, by the way, this is the catastrophe. I'm going to give you the list, right, of business models in Sydney. For one, there are, what's going to happen to them, right? Public sector transport business model, what's going to happen to that? Office business model, what's going to happen to that? University business model, what's going to happen to that? Retail business model, what's going to happen to that? Tourism business model, what's going to happen to that? Culture and creative arts business models, what's happening to all that, right? So you see, this is potentially an existential crisis for the city, which I'm a bit worried we're not really kind of on top of. And that there's been a commission set up by the Committee for Sydney, which I'm involved in, which Arup is involved in, to try and get the evidence and understand the strategies that might lead to greater success with the CBD. Anyway, look, that's the kind of panorama.
Are we hanging on the thread of a vaccine that we don't know whether it's going to work or not, or multiple vaccines? That's really where we're at, isn't it? Because
I think that's true. It's interesting. It's interesting. I think it now does. I would have said 6 months ago, I was much more, and I still am, by the way, of the view that we should have had a slightly different strategy, which is not quite as radical in terms of locking down activities, but protecting the vulnerable a lot more than we've been doing. There's been a bit of a Western focus on lockdown, partly to, as they say, suppress the demand on the health services. So I'm not sure about that strategy, but I do think that going forward, it'll be quite critical. But again, you see, timing is an issue. If it takes another year for people to be confident about walking around this CBD or being in public transport, the damage we will do in 2021 is massive. Because people, will, whether they like it or not, change their behavior permanently. So you'll find that people have got used to not getting on a bus to go to work. They've got used to not going to work, right? So I think some of that will be long lasting, and it'll be longer lasting if we don't have the vaccine sorted quite quickly. And it's a confidence measure, I think, rather than just an actual direct health measure. But I was going to say that I think the unknowns are. Well, the unknowns are essentially, the other business model I think is quite critical to realise is not happening, and it brings us to our housing conundrum. Is every year for the last 10 years, 5, 6, 7 years, Melbourne grew at 120,000 people a year. Sydney grew at 90. This is why Melbourne was overtaking Sydney, by the way, as the biggest city in Australia, right? What happens now? So we've never lived in a world in Australia where cities aren't growing. What's that mean? And then all of a sudden, house prices were tanking for the first 3 or 4 months of the crisis. Housing numbers had gone down by half in terms of delivery. One thing we've not talked about, by the way, before we get to the housing thing, can we start? Is suburbia itself. In that I understand this. I'm partly intrinsically against suburbia at one level, because I kind of grew up in a working class version of a suburb, which was like quite a long way from anywhere. And so I've always loved, what the city density gives you, the culture, the arts, and all that kind of stuff. So I've been a bit skeptical. On the other hand, obviously, suburbs well away from the rather overheating CBD city centre are cheaper, and they offer family lifestyles in a way that you can't get sometimes. And I get all that. So I'm not like disrespectful of that. But economically, it's always been important. I always say to people that you've got to look at the word suburbia. It's sub of an herb. And the idea is the herb still has to pump value so that the suburb can benefit from it, and you can live in the suburb and get your money in the herb, right? That's the deal, right? So if the herb is struggling, how will the suburbs do better, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, evolving jobs are wonderful, but you have to ask why they haven't in the past been devolved, right? And it's just this knowledge economy premium. So I think we will see, again, a long-term consequence. I think people have rediscovered a bit what I think Arup has called actually nearby hoods, right? The stuff that they like nearby, like some of the coffee. You walk to the coffee, you walk to the green space, and so there will be, I think, a greater emphasis in cities thinking not just on the centre, but on the centres, on the slightly more decentralised, slightly more polycentric. But you still have to connect them. They're not like little islands, of value. They're connected. Otherwise, they're not valued.
I think that, I feel like so many people sort of views on life in the future and about working from home and how fantastic it is. It's driven by a desire to convince yourself that is the best option, because the alternative is something that you're actually fearful of, going into the city, going and doing things. And people, for that reason, they are accentuating the plus points of working from home, whilst pushing to the back of their minds the benefits of the city, we talked about it before we started recording, but live music, theatre, arts, the cultural events,
everything they love will die in front of them if the home working phenomenon is permanent. Everything that the sociability that we love is destroyed if they carry on. I mean, essentially that's the threat, right? And I also think I worry though. There's a kind of interesting. I think I told you about I have a slightly workerist view of the world, having grown up in a mining town, i.e. the deep well of common sense of like ordinary people, as we call them, and I worry that the essentially introspective, therapeutic universe of the kind of knowledge sector middle class, who for too long have created their value solely by pumping, their fingers at a dashboard, and they've begun to see the world through their eyes, rather than seeing that, as you were saying, that even the stuff that they love is damaged if they carry on too radically down this path. I think also that they are completely missing the kind of social control element of this whole discussion. It's so much easier for the man to control people in this kind of decentralized way when people come together and form crowds and teams, and they become much more powerful. So this atomization, we fought against this stuff forever. That the intrinsic nature of market society to atomize is now finding glorious support from otherwise progressive people who seem to think that medieval working conditions is somehow productive, or indeed progressive. I mean, I do feel that it's a bit like, family-based factory working back in the end of the 18th century, where you'd all be working in Dickensian conditions, and there'd be six of you, doing piecework together. I mean, at one point in 2020, I'm enjoying myself, by the way, at one point in 2020, we had, my wife working at home, my daughter working at home, and me working at home, all hating each other being at home, and actually pretending to be productive. And, I love what was said of the Soviet system towards the end, because it was a very unproductive way of working, and they said it was the workers wrote on the wall, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. And I think we're in a delusion, a bubble of delusion, that actually this can carry on and they're somehow healthy. I mean, the last thing is, how many of us, come on, have drank more? How many of us have eaten more? How many of us have done less exercise than ever before? For everybody learning how to macrame, the rest of us have just been vegging out in front of the bloody television, or our screen. We've been working 12 hours a day less productively. We're not going. We're all putting on weight. I mean, it is a catastrophe in terms of the public health outcomes, and there's no body that should doubt it, right? So, I mean, for example, here's a good real world example, right? And how about this? They did a study a few years back of what happened in an American city where they built a public transport link, a light rail. I think it was the Chattanooga, actually. So essentially, it wasn't there before. So people got out of their car, walked to the light rail station and got into the city centre on public transport. What happened? People lost 5 kilos in a year.
Just from the walking.
By walking to the public bus stop or the rail link, right? That's what happens. We're not talking about going into gyms. You know, I mean, like a gym membership is soared and people don't go to them.
Yeah.
As ever. That's the business model, by the way. They're clever. Right, you know. So essentially, it's a catastrophe for public health, right? It's a catastrophe for mental health, right? So we've got to get over ourselves. You know, this is not sustainable. And it's not right. It's like economically, morally, and in health terms, a setback, right? So come on, guys. And the other bit before we get to the housing bit, which I think we should talk about, is I've been stunned by the lack of response until very recently by business representative bodies and even by big companies who are renting out space in the city centres. I've been surprised. I think they've all been traumatized at one level, and another level, I think they've all been like put on the back foot as to what to say. You know, as to what you know. I can imagine the difficulty of saying, like, if you're a renter of public space in the office, my business model is bleeding to death, and people say, well, you know, there's people really dying out there, mate, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, okay, but you know, by the way, probably just to put it in context, this is such a staggering context. 1,000 people dying in Australia. I'm sure a multiple of that will have died because of the home working experience, because it's so few people dying from COVID, but the lockdown has been more significant than that. Yeah. So, you know, come on, there is a serious argument made. I was making the point that before the recent setback in the Northern Beaches, you know, people like Perrottet in the New South Wales state government were really, I think, got it, and Anna Stokes as well, and they were beginning to campaign to try and reassure people. So I do think, for me, big campaign in 2021 is required to make sure that public transport feels healthy and safe, and people are reassured about that. We can do that. But there needs to be a real sense from the top, private and public sector working together. We have to repossess the city, right? Not abandon it.
How's it going to happen, Tim? Where's that going to come from?
Well, you know, as I say, I think the government in New South Wales had begun to, and I hope it'll return to people like me. You know, will be pushing them on. I think this initiative from the Committee for Sydney and Arup around a commission on the future of the CBD. I noticed the Property Council stirred itself for the first time in a year on this matter about 2 weeks ago. You know, so I think there's stirrings now of, and I think what's helping as well is people are a bit fed up of you know, I think we're hankering. I mean, you know, I think you might ask me at the end what I'm most excited about. You know, I went out the other day for a lunch, so for the first time in such a long time, with like 7 or 8 friends, and we got a bit, let's say, squiffy, I think it's fair to say. You know, I'm excited by the sociability that will return. I'm sure of it. With the cities, you know, we've got some of the best cities on the planet. They're there to be enjoyed and not there to be worried about. So I think I'm looking forward to that. I am shocked by one thing which you've raised. I'm shocked by, in all this context of people dying, businesses closing down, blah, blah, economic, you know, we've gone back about, I think it's about -4% GDP for the final outturn, you know, plays -10 in the UK. So, you know, it's another good result, but it's still like a shock, you know. House prices stabilized and went up at the end. They've been going up at 4% a month since December. Houses, not units. What's that about? I think plays to what I think is the sickness in the housing market and the obsession with residential property in Australia. It's not. It's a problem. Yeah,
it's a cult.
It's a cult. It's funny. I call it housing porn, where people who are apparently decent people have dinner parties talking about the ridiculous amount of money that their house is going up whilst they're sitting on their backside doing nothing, just for the virtue of accidentally living in the right place at the right time. But also because public policy, and I've just written about this. Public policy in Australia, despite what the politicians say, is about keeping first-time buyers out of the market. Public policy is about raising house prices as the only economic lever they think they've got. And you were mentioning the RBA think there might be a 9% rise in house prices. That is sinful, right? It is a shocking thing to be proud of. Normal world economies, houses go up 2 to 3% a year. They're meant to be boring. Housing is meant to be a boring asset class. It is something you park your arse in, but it is not meant to be your main asset class. And the fact that it's become so in the Anglosphere generally, and in Australia particularly, is a lot of reasons. But one is around, there's some amazing tax incentive in Australia for home ownership and multiple home ownership. And I have to point out to people, I don't know if this sounds like rocket science, Paddy, but if somebody owns a second home, guess what? You're creating a renter, right? So, think about it logically. You can't have multiple home ownership without creating renters, right? It's a zero-sum game, right? You can't, what's the point of me having multiple homeowners if I can't get some? And how do I do it? I outbid them for the home. Why? Because I've got 3 homes.
Yeah.
Right. So come on, it doesn't make any sense, right? So whatever they think the macroeconomic consequences of house price rises are, and by the way, not all benign, because we're not investing in manufacturing, we're not investing in industry. Here's a number for you. The Germans, as a British person, I always like to think the Germans are doing badly, but they tend not to. So Germany, still is one of the more productive economies, certainly in Europe, partly on the planet. Only invests 50% of its bank money in housing. 50% goes into industry. Guess what? In Britain, it's 80%. In Australia, it's 85%. Of all bank finance goes into residential property.
You mentioned first-time home buyers there, and both in, we were talking about the UK and Australia because we sort of bounce between the two. You certainly do sort of work-wise, but the both governments and let's sort of focus on Australia because we're here, but in particular have put a lot of on paper or in the press or in the media, a lot of focus on first-time home buyers and the different schemes that are available to them. What do you think about those schemes then?
I think it's funny in this. I don't think they mean badly. I think they just don't understand the housing market. It's quite interesting. I was always stunned when I used to go into government agencies in Australia and England, actually. And because I learned late. I was the government advisor in the UK, and I was suddenly taught what the actual business model of the development sector was back in 2007-8 by a genius in the UK called Tony Pidgley, who ran Berkeley Homes. Yeah, I know. He was a flash-right thug, and I loved him. And he died about a year ago. And he was a brilliant bloke, a great businessman. And he just told me that it's a residual value game, and they do return on capital employed, so they won't build a brick for the developer unless they can make 22% return. Capital. So when I took that fact into some of the Australian bureaucracy, and they said, run that by us again. I said, that means that they have no business. Their business is not generating units, whether or not they make a return. Their business is making a return. So if they can't make 20%, they will not build a brick for you, right? So the idea that they're like a manufacturing process that can endlessly, and they produce so many homes that the price goes down. I then said, you think about that. I'm going to develop it. I'm going to build you more houses when the price goes down. I build you more houses when the price goes up, right? So it's all that in the backdrop. What I think governments have not understood the housing sector at all. It's not a manufacturing process. Right? They don't understand the risks that these guys have to take. So the 22% return, the banks won't lend them the money. All this. The banks won't lend them the money unless there's a real cushion. And that 22% means that they have got a natural limit on the number of homes that they will build. So they're not going to build you to affordability. They're just not going to do that. They can't do that. That's a government intervention has to be required to make that happen. So the government intervention they come up with is the wrong one, which is they're stoking up the house prices by giving first-time buyers grants. That changes, that it makes it worse. If you give me $25,000 for some purpose, I will go to my bank and they will give me 6 times $25,000 to bid more on the price of a home. So it goes straight on the bottom line. So every one of these grants that they've ever done has gone straight to the bottom line and raised the price of housing. And at the same time, the general macroeconomic policy that they're doing is raising house prices. RBA, the low interest rate environment is low interest rates equals high asset, right? So this is completely connected. So there's no way that by fiddling around with giving somebody a $20,000 grant, you're affecting the fundamentals in the housing market, except to push up the price. And what we're seeing is, even now, it's interesting. I thought this might be an occasion where there was a bit of a collapse in land and housing prices whilst income stayed stable. That's not happening. In fact, when we look at the results, Paddy, and I've never said this publicly before, but I'm sure this is true, is we will find that there's been an income differential between those people with stable jobs that are knowledge workers that have carried on sailing, and then people who tend to be in the first-time buyer segment with lower incomes, they've suffered more. So actually, and as prices go up in 2021 and incomes either stabilise or go down, the gap will grow. So I'm afraid the Australian machine for generating house price inflation is alive and well.
And those speculators are going to be there waiting to pick up those lower value sort of units to rent them back again.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that and we've found a culture and a set of policies to incentivize multiple home ownership and investors who are far higher proportion of the housing market in Australia than in the UK. And then we're surprised when house price inflation is the result. We seem amazed that you can generate multiple home ownership on the one hand and house price rises, and then we think, oh my goodness me, why the first time buyer not able to enter the market? So for me, public housing is an absolute must, and it's not about charitable giving to the poor. It's about creating alternative providers in the market who do not have the same business model exposed to land risk that the house developers have. And then perhaps we can do what Singapore does, which is you rent until you can afford to buy.
Yeah. So were you part of the team in? So I was recruiting in. I was sort of Bristol and Birmingham based in the UK. I got my first job in the Blair years. I voted Labour. I'm a natural Conservative, but I did vote for Tony Blair. I have to say.
I think there's no contradiction in that statement. So
but I remember when I was working in the UK, social housing really took off. I mean, the way that they sort of created the housing associations, but then the next sort of iteration of that was first of all, the developers had to put community housing into their development. So there's a certain percentage, especially in London, and then there was the shared ownership sort of models. Do you think do you think we're going to see some of that coming here?
Yeah,
now?
It's funny. I've tried and failed on inclusionary zoning, as we call it, which is the mandatory proportion. I thought the Greater Sydney Commission were going to do it, and they didn't. But I always ask the question, why is it that Lendlease can do 40% social housing in London and 0 in Sydney? Yeah. And, come on, guys, that's got nothing to do with land values and blah, blah, that's just policy. And the way in which Lendlease do it, they're not better people in London and worse people in Sydney. They're just not. It's not that. It's the requirement. It's the residual land value. They pay less for the land, right? So it actually has the beneficial effect of taking some heat out of land prices because the landowner expectations are suppressed by the fact that the buyer, the developer says, I'm sorry, it's worth, before residual land value, it's worth 2 million a hectare, but with the social costs I'm going to be asked to do, I'm going to give you 1.2. And that's the deal, right? So that it's because we haven't set as a value the public policy of creating public housing that we're in this condition. I think the second thing around social shared equity is absolutely essential because I think you mentioned the Singapore outcome. Singapore outcome is not that everybody lives in rental forever. They use the rent and it's commuted into a mortgage over time, and you end up owning your unit. And I think that's a good system and takes a lot of the land risk away. This is like leasehold rather than freehold and all that kind of stuff. There are ways of doing it, but government has to start selling its land discounted to the developers because the developers can't do everything. I've never been critical. It's funny, I've been hard line about the reality, but never critical of the developer because that's not their business. And the business is government to mandate certain things and on its own land to insist that its own land agencies do this.
So some of the developers, or probably less, let's call them developers, but more in infrastructure investors in the UK, and I think it's going to come. I think it looks like it's going to come here.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Especially with the dearth of PPPs available because money's so cheap, is that actually some of those investors are going to start driving unsolicited sort of proposal bids to go down PPP routes for these things. I don't think
PPP is the right answer to that, which I will explain if you wish. But I think
a similar model.
I think buy to rent to buy to rent. We need new models in the housing system, and we need new business providers with different business models. So the long-term interest, the long-term lower income needs of the infrastructure investments is a better base than the 22% return on capital employed. The reason why the PPP thing is difficult is because of the land risk. The PPPs are better when it's a low risk environment, but you're just borrowing money essentially on pretty guaranteed income streams. So I don't think that, but I do think we need to find ways to reduce the risk to get new entrants into the market. We can't carry on with, by the way, the guy that proves, I always thought, I've never had an opportunity to say this publicly. You really brought this out of me, Paddy.
It's good. It's good work.
No, it's interesting. I'm obviously locked in a loft, so I desperately need to talk, is the Harry Triguboff example shows perfectly. I'm not sure I've said as many benign things about Harry as I'm about to say, because he's extraordinary. But is this? His business model is so different to a Lend-Lease or a Stockland or any of them. What he does is that he shows what I'm saying, I think is true about the problem with supply in the current market, is that he will build 500 where the others will build 250 because he will sell 250 and they will sell 250, but he will keep 250 back for rental. So he will build more in the same period that they will only build half. And he will sell all of them over time, or indeed sometimes he buys them back into rental. But his business model is incredibly flexible, but shows to me that by having a different business model in the market, he is able to achieve different results. So if anybody wants to know how to generate more homes without having the problem of the natural limit set by the business model of the developers, have a look at Harry Triguboff, right? So for me, that's what's missing. The kind of public sector should do a Harry Triguboff, because there's no way that Lend-Lease can build twice as many as their market appraisal says they can, and that's a problem, right? So look, I think we need new models, new business models. We need shared equity. We need all these things. I think you're also right about saying new entrants to the market, and they're coming. They need a little bit more. I mean, the buy to rent kind of people or rent to buy, whatever it is. They're essentially the capital gains has been the problem with getting new entrants in. If we could take some of the land risk out and they don't rely on 9% uplift a year, but they rely on this 4 to 5%, where it is. I think we are going to see. I think you're alluding to this. I'm going to see that the bankers and the investors and the finance houses becoming more important in the built environment going forward than the developers.
They need places to put their money. We need new products and I think governments need to really think through that. It isn't just about tolling. We can use this model to do other infrastructure projects, and we need to. So I think that I would be optimistic that the kind of and you see with people like Plenary who are doing infrastructure investment, but also been putting their toes in the water on housing, public housing. I haven't quite got the model yet, but they're obviously looking, and I think they're pretty symptomatic of an interest in. And also, we know the social funds and the kind of self-invested, the super funds and all that. Yeah, and John Lang, obviously, very big in the UK in that space. And
well, it's interesting. In fact, I don't know if you know, but one of the biggest housing providers in the UK now is one of the big insurance companies.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's been a shift there, and I'm sure we'll see the shift over here. There you go.
There we go. Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up. I think we could probably talk forever and about this and many other things from what I can tell. I've asked you about what you're looking forward to, and you said there was that social aspect, which I have to say I agree, because we took the family out for my daughter's birthday on Sunday, and it was such a pleasure just to go out for a Sunday lunch for a pizza. It was great. Tell us what you're looking forward to, or your predictions for the Six Nations.
Well, they're both the same thing, I think. The thing I'm looking forward to most, and I look forward to all the time and every day I think about it, is making sure that Wales. Two things, you see, not just the Six Nations. We live in Australia. We've got to beat the Aussies and we've got to beat the New Zealanders. We haven't beaten the New Zealanders since 1953, right? It's crazy stuff, right? So I won't believe in what I'm hoping for in 2021 is that Wales, really gets back on top of its rugby tradition. Bring back Gatling is what I think. But my worry is that the English will prevail again, and that obviously is a crime against God, as you know. So on the slightly even more personal front, I mean, I'm sort of I haven't seen my sister for it'll be about 18 months. It's the longest time I've never seen her. She and I, as we are all siblings, war and rage and fight. But I bloody miss her, and she's been struggling a bit because her partner's of an age where they've been locked down a lot in the UK. So I'm looking forward to having a trip to see the old country, by which I mean South Wales, as you know. And although I've a story to end about Australia, right? So when I came here 10 years ago, I saw a house opposite had a Welsh name on it. I thought, it can't be. So I go across, and there's a guy on the door, and I said, look, I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Welsh? He said, yeah, I'm from Wales. And I said, where are you from? He said, well, I'm from a place you probably never heard of called Pontypridd. And I said, well, I'm from Pontypridd. And he said, well, actually, to be precise, I'm from a mining village called Beer, about 4 miles from Pontypridd. I said, I'm from Beer. He said, you're completely accurate. I'm from a street called Hale Cronier. And I said, well, I was born there. And we had lived next door to each other.
Is that right?
45 years before. I hadn't seen him in 45 years. And that was good enough, right? And then two things which to end. One, he rings, this is for me like a big emotional moment. He rings home, comes back with food and I said, what are you doing? He said, I've been told I got to look after you. And I said, no, we both come from this mining public housing, but we both did quite well. I see you've got a bigger bloody house than me. He's a brickie, and he's been in the blue collar republic that Australia is, and never seen a better off working class in any country that I've ever been in. And I've been to 5 universities, and I've wasted my time, right? So if I'd only become a brickie in Australia, right? Yeah. So anyway, I said, he said, no. How about learning something about Wales and your family in Australia, right? I've never said this publicly before, but how about this? He then says, well, I've been told I got to look after you because your mother looked after us. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when our father left us with 6 kids, your mother used to give us food, right? Oh, wow. So, and I said, what, for a couple of weeks or something? He said for a couple of years, right? Yeah. So this is a person I realized I didn't know. I didn't know my mother. So I'm ending on a kind of note of an amazing, for me, kind of emotional Welsh-Australian link, and also a kind of discovery of how well this guy from a really quite tough, really quite impoverished background in Wales has done in Australia. And my only challenge going forward is, are we sure in Australia that we're the same culture and the same economy that enabled that guy to transform his life through working in the built environment? Or are we now a more elitist and protectionist society? I leave you with that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's another half-hour conversation. But Tim, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
And I'm excited to get this out to people and to let people hear what you've got to say. So thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me, man.
Pleasure.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Integrated Infrastructure is powered by North Search, specialists in executive and technical search across engineering, design, construction, property and energy markets in Australia. If you'd like to find out more about North Search or get involved with this podcast, you can click on the links in the show notes or email me directly at the address on the screen. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Integrated Infrastructure. Please tell your friends and colleagues if you did, and we hope to see you again soon.